The mill was running fine. The orders were filled. The roof didn't leak, and the woodpile stood taller than a man. Arthur Cobb was 59 years old, and he had not been lonely a day in his life, or so he told himself every morning while the coffee brewed and the silence pressed in from all four walls. He had been telling himself that for 11 years. The town of Millhaven sat in the Ottawa Valley the way a stone sits in a stream, not going anywhere, not trying to. It had a post office that doubled as a hardware store, a diner that closed at 2 in the afternoon because Loretta, who owned it, said anything past 2 was just tempting fate, and a lumber mill that Arthur's father had built in 1951 and that Arthur had been running since he was 34. There were 600 people in Millhaven, and every one of them knew Arthur Cobb's truck by the sound of the engine. He was a big man, not in a showy way, broad through the shoulders from years of real work, with hands that looked like they'd been borrowed from someone slightly larger. His hair had gone gray at 40 and white at 50, and he wore it short. He didn't own a mirror in the main part of the house. There was one in the bathroom, and he used it for shaving, and that was the extent of his vanity. His wife, Carol, had died in February 11 years ago. Pancreatic, 14 weeks from diagnosis to the end. He had held her hand through all of it, and he had not cried at the funeral because he had already used up everything he had. And after, people had brought him casseroles for 3 weeks and then stopped, which was the right thing to do, and he had gone back to the mill. He did not think about remarrying. He thought about the mill and the winter roads, and whether the Hendersons' property line had shifted since the survey, and what it was going to cost to replace the secondary saw blade in spring. He was 59 years old. He had had his life. It had been a good one. That was the arithmetic of it. Then, on a Thursday in September, the new schoolteacher moved into the Prentice house at the end of Concession Road 7. Her name was Willa Sutton. She was 28 years old. She had driven up from Kingston in a car that had clearly debated the journey at length, with 2 cardboard boxes in the back seat and a cat named after a bridge, Champlain, in a carrier on the passenger seat. She had taken the job at Millhaven Elementary because it was the only posting available in all of Eastern Ontario that didn't require her to move to a city, and Willa Sutton had tried cities twice and found them loud in a way that went deeper than sound. She was not a delicate person. She was 5'4" and moved like she had somewhere to be. She had dark hair that she kept in a braid that was always slightly unraveling, and she had a way of looking at people directly, not rudely, but completely, that some people found unsettling and that children, for some reason, trusted immediately. She had been in town 4 days when the drain pipe on the north side of the Prentice house separated from the eave trough and swung out at a 45-degree angle, pointing at nothing. Her neighbor, Pete Solecki, told her the only person worth calling was Arthur Cobb, because Arthur Cobb fixed things and didn't overcharge and showed up when he said he would. 3 qualities, Pete said, that were rarer than people admitted. So she called the number on the card Pete gave her, and Arthur answered on the second ring, and she explained the eave trough, and he said he'd come by Saturday morning. He came at 7:45. She had not expected him until 8. She opened the door in her work clothes, jeans, an old Carleton University sweatshirt, paint on her left forearm from the bedroom wall she'd been repainting, and she said, "I wasn't quite ready." And he said, "I can wait." And she said, "No, come in, the coffee's on." And that was how it started. He looked at the drain pipe. He went back to his truck for his ladder. She watched him from the kitchen window while the coffee finished, and thought that he moved with a kind of quietness that wasn't slowness, more like a person who had stopped needing to prove anything. He came in afterward and washed his hands at the kitchen sink without asking where the bathroom was, because the kitchen sink made more sense, and she handed him a mug, and he said, "Thank you." And they stood at the counter, and she asked how long he'd lived in Millhaven, and he said all his life, and she asked if he ever thought about leaving, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "I used to think about it. Now I just think about here." She wasn't sure why that answer satisfied her, but it did. He finished the coffee and left. He did not charge her for the eave trough, and when she called to ask about it, Pete Selecki told her that was just how Arthur was, and she should leave a bottle of something good on his porch and not make a thing of it, which she did. That was September. In October, her furnace made a sound. It was the kind of sound that a furnace makes when it is informing you, at length, that its opinion of the situation has changed. Willa texted Pete, who texted Arthur, who came by the following Tuesday after the mill closed. He was in the basement for 40 minutes. He came up and told her she needed a new igniter switch, but that it would hold until the part arrived, probably Friday. He said he'd be back Friday. She said, "Do you want to stay for dinner? I made too much soup." The sentence surprised both of them. He looked at her, not at the soup, at her, and said, "I wouldn't want to impose." She said, "You fixed my furnace. The least I can do is give you soup." It was a Tuesday in October. They talked for 2 hours. About the mill, about Kingston, about her first class of grade 3s, and the boy who had cried on the first day, and then become the loudest child in the room by week 2, which she found wonderful, about Carol. He said her name carefully, the way you say the name of something that is healed, but still has texture. She did not push and she did not retreat. She just listened. He left at 8:30 and drove home in the dark and sat in the kitchen for a while without turning on the television. He told himself it was just soup. On Friday, he came back with the igniter switch. He didn't stay for dinner. He was in and out in 30 minutes, and he drove home with the radio on, which was unusual because he normally drove in silence. November came in sideways, the way it does in the Ottawa Valley, with 3 days of freezing rain that glazed everything and kept the school buses home. Willa's cat, Champlain, developed a theory that the heating vent in the living room was the center of the known universe and refused to move. She graded papers and listened to the ice tick against the windows and thought, once, about the man who had fixed her furnace and talked about his wife like she still existed somewhere in the house. She was not thinking about it seriously. She was just thinking. She saw Arthur at the post office in the second week of November. He was picking up a package. She was mailing a letter to her grandmother in Guelph. He held the door for her. She said, "Thank you." He said, "How's the furnace?" She said, "Perfect." He said, "Good." And they stood for a moment in the cold doorway of the post office with the wind coming off the fields, and she said, "I'm making chili on Sunday if you want to stop by." And he said, "I don't want to be a bother." And she said, "You're not a bother, Arthur. You're the only person in this town I've had a real conversation with." And she walked to her car, and he stood in the cold for a moment before going inside. He almost didn't go on Sunday. He told himself it was foolish. He was 59 years old. She was 28. She was being neighborly, the way people in small towns are neighborly, and he was reading into it something that was not there because he was lonely in a way he had refused to name for 11 years. He stood in his kitchen on Sunday morning and looked at the window over the sink, the one that faced east, where the light came in clean in the mornings. And he thought about Carol. Not with grief exactly, more with the feeling of standing at the edge of a field and knowing it's yours, but also knowing you haven't walked it in a long time. He went to the chili. It was good chili. She used dried Anko peppers and she made cornbread from scratch, and she had 3 different kinds of hot sauce lined up on the counter like a Small's argument. He added the medium one. She added all 3 and didn't blink. He laughed at that. A real laugh, not the polite kind, and she grinned and said, "My grandmother always said the measure of a person was how they handled spice." And he said, "What does that say about me?" And she looked at him steadily and said, "That you're sensible. There's nothing wrong with sensible." They talked through the afternoon. Champlain sat on Arthur's boot for 40 minutes, which Willa said the cat had never done with anyone, and Arthur reached down once and scratched the cat's ears without making a thing of it. He left at 5. In the truck, sitting in her driveway for a moment before he turned the key, he thought, "This is going to be a problem, not because anything had happened. Nothing had happened. But it was going to. He could feel it the way you feel a change in weather. Not the storm itself, but the pressure dropping. The particular quality of quiet before the sky makes up its mind." He drove home. He did not turn the radio on. Now, I want to stop here for just a moment, because I know some of you are listening to this right now, maybe in your kitchen, maybe on a drive through something beautiful. And I want to ask, where are you listening from today? Are you up in British Columbia, watching the mountains? Out on the prairies where the sky goes on forever? Maybe you're in Newfoundland, where the wind has opinions. Leave a comment. Tell me your province, your town, your part of this country. And if this story is touching something in you, go ahead and give it a like. It means more than you know, and it helps other people find their way to stories like this one. Now, back to Arthur. December came and he kept his distance. Not coldly, he was never cold, but carefully. He found reasons not to drive past Concession Road 7. He nodded at Willa in the diner on the 2 occasions she came in for coffee, and she nodded back, and once she said, "I haven't seen you around," and he said, "Mill's been busy," which was true enough. He was managing it. That was the word he used in his head, managing. Pete Selecki noticed, because Pete noticed everything, and kept most of it to himself, which was why people told him things. Pete came by the mill one afternoon in the second week of December, supposedly to look at some boards for a fence repair, and after he'd looked at the boards for about 30 seconds, he said, "Willa Sutton asked after you." Arthur said, Pete said, "She said she thought she'd done something wrong." Arthur set down the board he was holding. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She hasn't done anything wrong." Pete said, "Maybe you should tell her that." Arthur didn't answer, and Pete didn't push, because that was also not how Pete operated. But that night, Arthur sat in the kitchen with his coffee going cold beside him and thought about a 28-year-old woman sitting in the Prentice house, wondering what she'd done to make the man who fixed her furnace stop saying hello. And something in him felt ashamed. Not of the feelings. He had stopped being ashamed of those, but of the way he was handling them. Retreating into himself like the world required it. Like being 59 years old was a sentence he had to serve. Carol had never thought that way. Carol had been 52 when she got sick, and she had spent every one of those last 14 weeks more present than she'd ever been. Asking questions, listening, holding his hand like she was memorizing the weight of it. She had not retreated. She had moved toward everything, right until the end. He thought about that for a long time. On the 19th of December, there was a light freezing rain in the afternoon that turned the roads into something treacherous by evening. He heard about it from the radio at the mill and then from Pete via text, and he thought about Concession Road 7, which had a low section near the culvert that iced over first. He drove out there at 5:30. Not to see Willa, just to check the road. That was what he told himself. Her porch light was on. He could see it from the culvert. He sat in the truck at the end of her driveway for 3 minutes. Then he drove up. She answered the door already in her coat, holding her car keys. He said, "Where are you going?" She said, "I was going to drive out and put some sand down on the culvert section." He said, "You were going to do that yourself," she said. "Someone has to." He looked at her. She looked at him. The freezing rain ticked against the brim of his hat and made small sounds on the hood of his truck. He said, "I'll do it. I've got sand in the back." She said, "I'll come with you," he said. "You don't need to." She said, "I know I don't need to, Arthur. I want to." They drove to the culvert. He spread sand. She helped, scooping it with an old coffee can she'd found in the truck bed, working without being asked. The freezing rain had mostly stopped, and the sky was that particular dark blue that only happens in December in Canada, and there was a smell. Cold water, cedar, something mineral from the road salt. That was one of those smells you only get in one place. When they were done, she put the coffee can back in the truck bed and leaned against the tailgate and said, "Can I ask you somethings?" He said, "Sure." She said, "Did I do something wrong?" "Back in December, early December. You stopped coming around and I thought maybe I said something." He looked at the road. He looked at his hands. He said, "No, you didn't do anything wrong." She said, "Then what happened?" He was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was sitting right there, and it was the kind of answer that once said could not be unsaid, and he was 59 years old, and the last time he had told a woman something true about his heart she had been Carol, and Carol was gone. He said, "I'm 59 years old, Willa." She waited. He said, "You're 28." She still waited. He said, "I just thought it would be simpler if He stopped. He started again. "You're at the beginning of something. I'm well into the middle of mine. I didn't want to complicate your beginning." She was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that has weight to it. Then she said, "Do I get to have a say in what complicates my beginning?" He didn't answer. She said, "I'm not looking for someone to rescue me, Arthur. I'm not looking for someone young and exciting. I came to this town because I wanted something real and something quiet and something that lasts. I don't know what this is between us. I'm not saying I do, but I'd like to find out, and the only person in the way of that right now is you." He looked at her then, really looked at her, 28 years old and completely unafraid of the dark or the ice or the thing she had just said out loud in the freezing night on a gravel road in the Ottawa Valley. He said, "I'm not an easy person." She said, "I didn't ask for easy." He said, "I keep strange hours." She said, "I have a cat who runs the household. I'm used to strange hours." He said, "I haven't. It's been 11 years. I don't know how to." She said, "Arthur." Her voice was very calm. "Neither do I. We could just start with dinner." He looked at the road for a long time. Then he looked at her. He said, "Okay." She said, "Okay." They drove back to her house in the dark. She made eggs because it was nearly 7 and neither of them had eaten. He sat at her kitchen table with Champlain weaving around his boots, and she scrambled eggs with sharp cheddar and put toast on. And the kitchen was warm and smelled of butter and old wood, and the particular smell of a house that has recently been made someone's home. They ate and talked, and at 9:30 he said he should go. And she said yes, and he stood at the door for a moment and said, "Thursday?" And she said, "Thursday." He drove home in the dark, and the roads were clear and the sky had opened up, and there were more stars over the valley than a person deserved on a Tuesday night in December. He did not tell himself it was nothing. He didn't have it in him anymore. In January, they had dinner on Thursdays. In February, it moved to Thursdays and Sundays. In March, when the mill work slowed and the roads were still bad, he came by on Wednesday evenings too, and they read in the same room, her on the couch with Champlain, him in the chair by the window, and they didn't always talk, and that was the thing. The silence was easy. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't ask anything of you. He met her grade 3 class in April, when she needed someone to come explain what a sawmill did for the community history unit. He stood at the front of the room with 23 8-year-olds looking at him, and he told them about wood grain and how you could read a tree's whole life in its rings. And a girl named Abby asked him how old the oldest tree he'd ever cut was, and he said 130 years, and the whole class went quiet, in the way that children go quiet when they've just touched something very large, and Willa stood at the back of the room watching him and thought, "There he is." Pete Selecki found out in May, not because anyone told him, but because Pete noticed things, and he called Arthur on a Saturday and said only, "Good," and hung up. And Arthur held the phone for a moment and then laughed and put it in his pocket. In June, Arthur's daughter, Catherine, she was 31, lived in Ottawa with her husband and their 2 daughters, came to Millhaven for the long weekend. Arthur had told her about Willa in April on the phone in the straightforward way he did most things, and Catherine had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Dad, are you happy?" And he'd said, "I think I might be," and she'd said, "Then that's the only thing that matters." She brought the girls to the mill on Saturday morning and let them run in the sawdust, and on Saturday evening, the 5 of them, Catherine, her husband Marcus, the 2 girls, Arthur, had dinner at Willa's house. Willa made roast chicken and roasted potatoes with rosemary from the little pot on her windowsill, and the older girl, who was 6, decided immediately that Champlain was hers, and Champlain tolerated this with the dignity of a cat who has seen much and expects more. After dinner, when the girls were watching something on Marcus's phone and Catherine was helping Willa with dishes, Catherine said quietly, "He's different than he was." Willa said, "Different how?" Catherine said, "He laughs more. He calls now just to talk. He didn't used to do that." She was quiet for a moment, her hands in the soapy water. "After my mother died, he went very far away. Not physically. Just, he went somewhere inside himself and kept working, and we all pretended that was fine because what else do you do?" She paused. "He's come back. That's what's different. He's back." Willa didn't say anything. She dried a pot. Catherine said, "I just wanted you to know that." Arthur, in the other room, was helping Marcus settle a dispute between the 2 girls about the cat. He was 59 years old, going on 60 in August, and his knees hurt in damp weather, and he still kept strange hours. And he had never learned to take photographs on his phone, and he was the kind of man who said very little but meant everything he said. He looked up from the cat dispute and caught Willa's eye through the kitchen doorway, and she was already looking at him, and she smiled. Not the wide public smile, but the small one, the real one. And he nodded once, in the way that meant something, and turned back to the cat. They got engaged in October, on the anniversary of the freezing rain on Concession Road 7, which was not a thing either of them had planned. It simply turned out to be the night he looked at her across the kitchen table and said, "I want to do this properly. I want to ask you properly," and she said, "Then ask," and he said, "Willa Sutton, I am 59 years old, and I am entirely certain of very few things, but I am entirely certain of you." And she said, "Yes, obviously yes. You were always going to ask, and I was always going to say, 'Yes, Arthur.' We were just waiting for you to catch up." And he laughed, and it was the realest laugh she had heard from him, the kind that came from somewhere underneath the reserve, and she thought she would spend a long time listening for that sound. The wedding was small, in Millhaven, in the spring. Pete Solecki was there. Loretta closed the diner for the afternoon and brought 3 pies. Catherine stood beside her father and held his arm, and the 2 girls were the flower girls, and Champlain stayed home and presumably ran the household in everyone's absence. The minister said the old words. Arthur said them back. Willa said them back. The Ottawa Valley light came through the church windows and made everything gold the way it does in May, and Arthur Cobb, 60 years old, held Willa Sutton's hand and felt the weight of it. He had been a man who worked and was steady and kept his grief in a room with the door closed and told himself every morning that this was enough. And it had been enough. But enough and good are different countries, and the distance between them, it turned out, was not age. It was not 31 years on a calendar. It was one freezing night on a gravel road, and a woman who asked for a say in her own life, and a man who, eventually, had the sense to say, "Okay." I've told you this story because I think some of you know what it is to close a door inside yourself and call it peace, to mistake solitude for strength, and waiting for contentment. Arthur knew it. He'd been living inside that particular story for 11 years. But here's what I believe, after all the years and all the stories. The heart does not expire. It doesn't have a best before date stamped anywhere on it. It gets quieter sometimes. It gets careful. But it does not stop knowing what it wants. To everyone out there who is somewhere in the middle of your life, wondering if you've missed something, you haven't. The road doesn't close. Sometimes it just ices over for a while, and you need someone with a coffee can and no fear of the dark to come out and help you put the sand down. God bless you all, wherever you are tonight. Keep your roots where they matter, and keep riding.